Good morning. This is Ron. It is Thursday, May 17th. Welcome to Story Time. And again, welcome to Story Time, where the host is the only true conservative in the United States of America, because the host is the only person who makes the presumption for the status quo. So yesterday, on Wednesday, or it was the day before, one of the two, Israel, in Israel, the United States officially opened its embassy in Jerusalem, and there was a lot of violence associated with it, etc. But the one thing that this reminded me of was that how conservatives and how Republicans how easily they get rat trapped in political discourse. The Most conservatives are conservative because the Democrats say they are. Because the Democrats declared a long time ago, decades ago, that you are politically who you are based on where you stand on the issues. And of course, the Democrats decide what the issues are: abortion and the environment, in immigration, etc. So most Republicans fall right into line with that. And the international or foreign policy issue, particularly as it relates to the Middle East, is where do you stand on peace in the Middle East? So, and the issue really isn't about peace in the Middle East, and Republicans should know that, conservatives should know that, and they should act on it. Every time that they're asked about peace in the Middle East, their response should be the same. It should be that it is not peace that is needed at this particular point. It is Israeli security. That's the true issue. That there can be no peace without Israeli security, without the security of the Israeli state. That right now, Israel's under constant attack. It gets rocket attacks. It has terrorists that come across the border to either blow themselves up or start stabbing Israeli citizens. And how can you make or even start a peace process under that kind of scenario? We wouldn't do it in the United States. No other country would do that, would put up with that. We shouldn't expect Israel to do it either. So for the Republicans, the issue is and should be Israeli security, not Middle East peace. So, as you saw also on Tuesday with the Hamas-led Palestinians that were attempting to breach the borders of Israel, and I suppose get to Jerusalem and try to stop or disrupt the ceremony in Jerusalem. So when I come back, I'm going to be reading a New York Times book review. And I'm back, and today I'm going to be reading a New York Times book review, the review of the book called The Mars Room, and it's reviewed by a man named Charles McGrath, and this is from the current issue of the New York Times book review. And the book, The Mars Room, is by Rachel Kushner. It's 339 pages, put out by Scribner, $27. Rachel Kushner's second novel, The Flamethrowers, instantly established her as one of the most gifted writers of her generation, on the same tier as Jennifer Egan and the two Jonathans, Frenzen and Leathern. As the title suggests, it was a flamboyant book, brilliant to a point just short of show-offiness, and it somehow managed to fuse together sex, motorcycle racing, Italian labor strife, and the New York art world of the 1970s. Made everyone's top 10 list, was a finalist for the 2013 National Book Award. I was one of the judges, and quickly got snapped up by the movies. Now we have her much anticipated third novel, The Mars Room, and though it too has already been optioned, it couldn't be more different from The Flamethrowers, or for that matter, from Kushner's first book, Telex from Cuba, also an NBA finalist. That was a historical novel about some American families living in Cuba in the mid 1950s, just before the Castro Revolution. It was so earnest and evocative, so meticulously researched, with walk on parts for Hemingway, both Castro brothers, and Desi and Lucy, that it almost felt like a throwback. The one hint that the author might be up to something more original was a subplot involving an exotic dancer named Rachel Kay. No coincidence, surely, who turns out, like her novelist creator, to be both an illusionist and an observer who misses nothing. The Mars Room is much smaller in scope than either of its predecessors and seemingly more modest, with less swagger in the writing. It's a page turner all the same, and in some ways more affecting than the other books. It's a prison novel, of all things, set mostly in a place called the Stanville Women's Correctional Facility in California's Central Valley, and, except to readers who don't get Netflix, will immediately bring to mind the hit series Orange is the New Black. But Stanville's a much darker place than the show's minimum security facility, and the novel is both more blackly comic and more knowing about prison life. You can learn from it how to communicate with other cells through the plumbing and how to brew Pruno or prison moonshine, or whip up a prison cheesecake using Sprite and non-dairy creamer. Only the losers, the prisoners with no money, eat in the chow hall, it turns out. The rest dine in their cells on junk food and ramen noodles purchased from the commissary. The novel's main character is Romy Hall, a 29-year-old serving 2 life sentences plus 6 years. I won't reveal what lands her in jail except to say she's guilty, but that there are extenuating circumstances ignored by her hapless, fuming public defender. Romy is hardly innocent, though, growing up in the unfashionable Sunset District of San Francisco, described in great detail by Kushner. The fog, the clamminess, the beach bonfires, the sticky-floored Irish bars. She becomes an almost feral street kid, drinking, shoplifting, doing drugs, and thinking about selling them, all before she's barely pubescent. Romy is bright enough, but drifts through high school getting high, and afterward makes her living by giving lap dances at a strip bar called the Mars Room, a place so seedy, she says, that if you showered you had a competitive edge, and if your tattoos weren't misspelled, you were hot property. Except for an art teacher she takes up with for a while, her taste in men runs to dirt bags, and with one of them, the doorman at another strip bar, she has a child, Jackson, who is 7 when the novel begins. He's a sweet, charming boy, and she loves him after her fashion, but is at best an indifferent mother. Jackson spends so much time fobbed off on a neighboring Hispanic family that he starts speaking Spanish. On what will prove to be her last Thanksgiving as a free woman, Romy parks him with a babysitter and spends the day with one of her Mars Room regulars. Part of Kushner's achievement here is that she makes this character, for all her shortcomings, so appealing. Romy's narration darts around in a voice that is tough, cynical, a little defensive at times, but ruthlessly honest and without a trace of self-pity. She has some of the bruised sweetness of Dennis Johnson's Alkies and Junkies in Jesus' Son. That Romy is white makes her something of an exception at Stanville. White prisoners, she says sarcastically, tend to be either drunken drivers or baby killers, and in fact, she has a baby killer roommate, the aptly named Laura Lip, who never shuts up. Many of the others, some of whom she eventually bonds with in a kind of extended prison family, come from even worse circumstances. You feel that they were practically programmed to wind up in jail. But Kushner imparts to them, too, a redemptive gloss of dignity and individuality. Romy's best friends are Conan, a trash-talking trans man, so masculine-seeming that he gets sent to a male prison for a while, and the gentle, philosophical Sammy, so at home in prison that she invariably manages to get sent back there. She thinks of her paroles not as departures, but as vacations. Some of Stanville life we get to see through the eyes of a character named Gordon Hauser. Except for the Fuds, as Conan calls the guards, He's one of the very few non-prisoners in the book, but in his own way he's almost as confined. He's a graduate school dropout who never finished a PhD thesis on Thoreau, and after a stint as an adjunct at community college, settles into teaching GED classes in prison because the money's better and it seems easier. Lonely and depressed, he commutes to Stanville from an isolated cabin in the Sierra foothills, where he spends way too much time studying the journals of Ted Kaczynski. Gordon is well-intentioned, but morally a little obtuse, a stand-in for the reader, perhaps. And his gradual discovery of the mindlessness and injustice of prison life, especially on death row, is one of the book's plot levers. Kushner says of the lifers, all of them were people who suffered, and along the way of their suffering, they made others suffer. And Gordon could not see that making them suffer lifelong would accrue to justice. It added new harm to old. The other thing driving the plot is the death, about halfway through, of Romy's mother, who, though herself a lousy parent, has been taking care of Jackson, who is now catapulted into the system. Because she is no longer his guardian, legally speaking, Romy can find out nothing about him, and the more she is rebuffed by legalese and bureaucratic mumbo-jumbo, the more she anguishes. The Mars Room makes you share her frustration. It's one of those books that enrage you even as they break your heart. And in its passion for social justice, you can finally discern a connection between all three of Kushner's novels. Both Telex from Cuba and The Flamethrowers paid glancing attention to the downtrodden and the exploited. Sugar cane cutters in Telex, Brazilian rubber gatherers and Italian factory workers in Flamethrowers. The Mars Room, the neglected become the focus, and it's apparent that Kushner's imagination, almost Dickensian in its amplitude, also embraces some of the Dickens reformist zeal. In its small way, the Mars Room does for prison what Hard Times and Nicholas Nickleby did for the 19th century education. The Flamethrowers was in love with speed and with anarchy, with moments during a strike, when an urban riot, a New York City blackout, when the rules are suspended and everything is up for grabs. The Mars Room, on the other hand, chafes against the slowness and sameness of time and the oppressiveness of a system that in the name of justice dooms our poorest citizens to lives of incarceration. It's not giving away too much to say that, like most good prison novels, this one ends with an escape. There are two, actually, one clearly based on Richard Matt and David Sweat's 2015 breakout in upstate New York. The other is a more bookish kind of escape and culminates in a moment of transcendence achieved mostly by literary style and authorial sleight of hand. It's eloquent and moving, but to me at least, it seems a little forced and wishful. The rest of Kushner's novel is so powerful and realistic, you come away convinced that all such escapes are illusory, and even for those who get out, prison is still a life sentence. Charles McGrath, former editor of the Book Reviews, working on an edition of David Barthelme's work for the Library of America. And when I come back, I'm going to be reading a couple of sections from a chapter in the Anglican Theological Review. So I'm back, and I'm going to be reading let's see what the title is here. Theological Interpretation, Second Naivete, and the Rediscovery of the Old Testament by R.W.L. Moberly. This essay is in 4 parts. The first briefly sketches some of the problems for Christian understanding and use of the Old Testament posed by contemporary ecclesial and academic culture. The second part considers some of the extensive conceptual resources that have become available in recent years through a revolution in hermeneutics. These make it possible to rethink the nature and purpose of the study of the Old Testament in terms of theological interpretation, which is still informed by the insights of modern historical critical scholarship, yet is simultaneously more engaged with the concerns of contemporary faith. The third part considers some other models for theological interpretation, especially the work of Walter Brueggemann and the Scripture and Hermeneutics Seminar led by Craig Bartholomew. The final part briefly considers the story of Cain and Abel in Genesis 4 as an example of a text that can be validly read in more than one way. I imagine that I'm not the only Christian to wonder sometimes whether Marcion may not be quietly smiling in his grave. Marcion has the dubious distinction of being the first person to be declared a heretic by the Christian Church. A major reason for this was his denigration of the Old Testament, and his contention that the deity of the Old Testament was not the God of the New Testament. However, it is one thing for the Church formally to disapprove of Marcion and to maintain that the Old Testament is an integral part of the Christian Bible. The God who creates the world and is the God of Abraham and of Israel is also the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. It is another to look at how Christian churches typically use the Old Testament in practice. My personal impression is that a large number of churches make little or no constructive use of the Old Testament, have little knowledge or comprehension of its content, and seem happy for the most part to manage without it. The singing of psalms has largely fallen by the wayside, and Old Testament readings are occasional. Sermons based on the Old Testament are rare, and more often than not, the preacher is unenthusiastic about its content and uses it as a negative foil for making a positive point drawn from the New Testament. The Old Testament in modern biblical scholarship. Although the likely reasons for this eclipse of the Old Testament are many and varied, I will briefly sketch in a broad brush way one likely contributory factor, at least in recent times. This is the persistence of a certain mismatch or incoherence between academic study and the ecclesial use of the Old Testament. The traditional Christian understanding of the Old Testament is that in some way speaks of Christ. The classic paradigm is presented by the story of Jesus and his disciples on the road to Emmaus, where Jesus, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. Luke 24:27. The ways in which Christians read the Old Testament in relation to Jesus has been embodied in liturgies down the ages and received wonderful artistic depiction in some medieval churches. For example, the scriptures around the doors at Chartres Cathedral or the windows in King's College Chapel, Cambridge. Yet the theological significance of traditional Christian reading has been diminished by the rise of a sharper historical awareness in modernity. Scholars have insistently asked what the scriptures of Israel meant to their original writers and readers before the coming of Jesus. They have found that they were richly meaningful in relation to the life of ancient Israel and Judah, and although there were hopes for the future, these did not take the form of awaiting the Messiah. Traditional Christian theological understanding has come to seem somewhat quaint and forceful, part of a rich cultural heritage, no doubt, but no longer a live contemporary option. The impact on the churches of this more sharply historical approach to Israel's scriptures in their ancient pre-Christ context, known in the 19th century as the higher criticism, was mixed. On the one hand, there was real gain. In the United Kingdom, Christian scholars such as S.R. Driver and George Adam Smith combined scholarship and faith in ways that made sense to many and made the new mode of scholarship acceptable in the mainstream churches. In particular, George Adam Smith's studies of the prophets, the book of Isaiah, and the book of the 12 prophets received a wide readership in the churches and were felt to bring the biblical texts into a fresh and illuminating focus. On the other hand, there was also loss. Historical insights suggested that the likely course of Israel's history and religious development was markedly different from its presentation in the Old Testament. The shorthand for this is that instead of the law coming before the prophets, as in the canonical presentation, the prophets came before the law, as famously argued by Julius Wellhausen. For many who were not scholars, this had a bewildering effect for understanding the biblical text, especially the Pentateuch. Was it just bad and unreliable history? And in any case, how did a knowledge of the best new scholarly hypotheses about the origins of Israel's sacred literature and the development of its religion help with the use of the Old Testament in Christian ministry and preaching? Famously, in 1852, Wellhausen resigned his chair of theology at Greifswald and explained his resignation thus: I became a theologian because scientific treatment of the Bible interested me. Only gradually did I come to understand that a professor of theology also has the practical task of preparing the students for service in the Protestant Church, and that I am not adequate to this practical task, but that instead, despite all caution on my own part, I make my hearers unfit for their office. Since then, my theological professorship has been weighing heavily on my conscience. The resignation is undoubtedly a tribute to Wellhausen's integrity, even though his "despite all caution on my own part" downplays the frequently snide and provocative comments he made about parts of the Old Testament that he did not like. But although he recognized that there was a problem about the relationship between scientific biblical scholarship and the life of the church, he had no idea what to do about it other than to opt unreservedly for scientific work. He thereby contributed to what became a long-term problem in the relationship between scholarship and faith. When I trained for ordination in the mid-1970s at Ridley Hall, Cambridge, and took a university BA in theology as part of my training, I remember being puzzled and frequently querulous about how the scholarly work I was doing, Pentateuchal criticism, Deuteronomistic, there we go, history, and so on, related to how I was going to preach from the Old Testament and use it in my ministry. Even worse, I remember the plight of a friend who was not doing the university degree, but an internal theological college's course, which one might perhaps expect to be more closely attuned to the questions and priorities of ordained ministry. This friend had to do 4 essays on the Old Testament during his training. The first was, did Abraham exist? The second was, when was Deuteronomy written? I forget the title of the third, and the fourth was, what was the date of Ezra's coming to Jerusalem? I find it hard to think of another set of questions more likely to put someone off valuing and using the Old Testament in their ministry. They are all, of course, legitimate questions, but they are the ancient history-oriented questions of professional scholars, not those of the average reader of the Old Testament, still less of those would-be preachers. This mismatch between the kind of agenda that students have regularly faced in their theological training and the needs of Christian life and ministry is surely at least one significant contributory factor in the eclipse of the Old Testament. Also indicative of the problem is the widespread scholarly preference for the supposedly religiously neutral term Hebrew Bible, instead of the specifically Christian term Old Testament. Against this background, I would like to sketch something of the nature and significance of recent moves to develop theological interpretation, or the reading of the Hebrew Bible as Christian scripture. Numerous different factors have converged to produce something of a sea change in recent Old Testament study. It is not that everybody is now practicing theological interpretation, far from it. Rather, there is today an ever-growing plurality of approaches and methods within Old Testament Hebrew Bible scholarship, and it is increasingly unclear what holds them together beyond the fact that they are in some way talking about Israel's scriptures. Nonetheless, theological interpretation is now one among other established areas within the sphere of biblical scholarship, and it is an area of particular importance for Christian reading of the Old Testament. And when I come back, I'm going to wrap things up. Okay, so today I did things a little bit different. Instead of doing a critique of Rush Limbaugh and doing the jokes and whatnot, I'd found a couple of articles that, well, again, the article in the New York Review of Books, and actually picked up a book called the Anglican Theological Review, and it is from fall 2017. Volume 99, number 4. And I was reading both of these, and I liked putting them somewhat together because it illustrates one of the things that it seems to me is a big cultural issue in this country, and that is the difference between, in terms of how we communicate. There is communicating intellectually, which is represented by the Anglican Theological Review, and second is communicating by storytelling and verbal picture painting, and which is represented by the book. What is Let me see. Let's try that again. Oh, yeah. What is the name of this thing? The Mars Room. That's it. So, it, and that the left has a tendency to want to communicate and try to get the country to communicate by storytelling and verbal picture painting. And I think that it's much better to communicate on a regular basis intellectually through concepts and abstractions. There is a beauty to it. And that's what I like about reading the Anglican Theological Review. I'm not Anglican. I'm not a theological student. I don't have a PhD in theology or anything, but I enjoy reading it because it is rich in concepts and abstractions, and putting those concepts and abstractions together in a good way, in a way that communicates clearly, is beautiful. There is beauty, there is art, it is aesthetic in nature, and that's why I like to read that and other different types of reviews. There's philosophical reviews and whatnot, the independent review, etc. And whereas the Mars Room is, again, telling a story. And so the issue of exactly what it is that's being communicated is a little bit murkier. You have to try to interpret. You might have to read it 2 or 3 times and try and figure out what it is exactly that the author is getting at. Another way, of course, of communicating what it is that the author is getting at is through a reviewer or a critic. Years ago, decades ago, somebody came out and declared the death of the author or the death of the artist. And what they meant by that, and the death of the artist was the birth of the critic. That the idea that it used to be the idea was that the artist was trying to communicate something and communicate about their sense of life and metaphysical reality. And by coming out and declaring the death of the artist, death of the author, and the birth of the critic, it is showing the power of the critic and the reviewer to shape reality and to make decisions about who it is that's going to be a star as far as art and literature are concerned. Let's see. I want to find where the second book, the novel, The Flamethrowers, instantly established her as one of the most gifted writers of her generation. So the reviewer is now putting pressure on the reader that if you read this book and you don't like it, then there's something wrong with you. There must be something wrong with you because, after all, this woman is one of the most gifted writers of her generation, on the same tier as a couple of other authors, 3 authors I've never heard of: Jennifer Egan and the 2 Jonathans, Franzen and Leathern, as though there's only 2 Jonathans in the entire world. So again, a bit of a power play. Also, I liked reading this particular review of The Mars Room because it's typical of the left in that they like to communicate when they're telling stories, and they like to use a malevolent universe premise. And they start with the idea that everything sucks, everybody in the universe sucks, that that the world is a scary place, the universe is a scary place, it is completely unknowable, and that the best thing sometimes that you can do is try to survive or get by. It also is very deterministic. It suggests that again, that the reason that people do what they do is not because of free will, but because they're forced to by circumstances beyond their control. In this particular book, The Mars Room, the main character is in prison, even though they said that she did it. But they spend a lot of time, the author spends a lot of time explaining and making excuses. Well, she was born poor. She was using drugs when she was young and getting into trouble. Apparently, her parents weren't very good parents and not keeping her out of trouble. And so, because of that, then she of course is forced to become a dancer in a strip club and forced to have a child out of wedlock and forced into other circumstances that result in her being imprisoned. Not only her, but the people that she's imprisoned with are also victims, quote unquote. They are there because of due to circumstances beyond their control. And there's the one statement in here where they're talking about how prison, they don't understand how it is that, and I think it's one of the characters. Let me see if we can find um, let's see here. Let's see. Through the eyes of character, except for he's one of the very few non-prisoners. I think it's through Gordon Hosner. Let's see where we go. There we go. Says Kushner says of the lifers, all of them were people who suffered, and along the way of their suffering, they made others suffer. And Gordon could not see what making them suffer lifelong would accrue to justice. It added new harm to old. And again, this is all told from the standpoint of the penitents rather than telling it from the viewpoint of their victims. Because if you approach this issue or problem from the standpoint of the victims, then what good it does to put these people in prison for the rest of their life becomes immediately apparent. But that's one of the tricks that the left likes to use. They like to leave out part of the problem. They like to leave certain people out that are inconvenient to their preconceived notions. And in this particular case, it's crime victims that are left out of the equation when they only look at the people in prison. It is, of course, false to say that these people are in prison because of circumstances beyond their control. All of these people created their own circumstances. They chose to do drugs. They chose to commit crimes, and they eventually chose to commit crimes that gave them a life sentence. So, because everybody has free will, and we know that by our own experiences and by the evidence of our senses. So that today concludes this episode of Story Time. I thank you for listening, and until tomorrow, have a great day.